Gavin, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me, Anthony.
So your piece on periodizations landed on my desk at exactly the right moment. I've been thinking about the periodization of Greek literature, and which, in a certain sense, Greek literature is what binds everything together for me, from Homer to, my own life. And sometimes when people ask me, like, what language courses do you teach? I say any Greek prose, any period. So I've been thinking about how this thing can be chopped up into pieces, and because we have to do it on some level. I mean, I would prefer not to have periodization, but I understand that for practical reasons, we do. But also, it's a fact that it exists. So let's talk about this fact and what we face. And so you talk about the Latin side. I might interject with some comments about the Greek side. Sometimes they're similar, sometimes they're different, right? So to set the stage, can you tell us when Latin literature begins and when it ends, however you want to define that?
Okay, so we've got literary texts from about the late third century BC, the time of Rome's wars with Carthage. Probably the first Latin poem we know of is a translation of the Odyssey from 240s, perhaps 230s, by Livius Andronicus. And the other first texts are all also versions of Greek literature, tragedies and comedies. Few of these survive intact until we've got the body of work of Plautus from around the turn of the third to the second century. And what this emphasizes, it wasn't really inevitable the Romans were going to have their own literature, rather than writing in Greek. The first Roman historian, Fabius Pictor,
Yeah.
writes in Greek. That's the beginning. Then, of course, Latin just becomes the language of the Latin-speaking west of the Roman Empire, in many places ousting the local languages, and it becomes a language of government and law in the east of the Roman Empire. But it lasts after the Western Roman Empire stops functioning. It lasts long after it as a literary language and as an administrative language, long after people stopped speaking it as a first language in the perhaps second half of the first millennium AD. And it's also spread to places the Romans had never been to the Catholic countries of Northern Europe and beyond Europe, to South America. The Jesuits took it to China. And so you've got well over a millennium after the end of the Roman Empire as Europe's lingua franca. When does it end? Well, that's quite difficult because there are still people who are writing Latin today, and they'd be very offended if you said that
Yes.
Latin literature was over. And there are some mildly distinguished poets from maybe the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, but let's just say it's pretty attenuated flow. So if you start in 250 BC and give it 2000 years, that would be the main things that we're interested in.
Okay, great. Big picture again, what are the main periods into which we divide this corpus, which otherwise has a continuous history?
Yeah.
So how do we conventionally divide it?
Okay, so we can divide and we can subdivide it. The main periods, though, would be Latin of antiquity, going down, say, to the 6th century AD or thereabouts.
Hmm.
Some people might want to subdivide it and talk about classical Latin going up to about 150 or 200 AD, and then some sort of later Latin. Other people would take classical Latin as just being the Latin of antiquity, including me. Then there's clearly medieval Latin, and that is perhaps let's make our periods overlap, because I think it's always a good idea to have periods overlapping slightly so you don't miss anything out at the edges. Medieval Latin, we can give it a broad millennium from 500 to 1500. And then we can have the common name is Neo-Latin, but before that you might want to put in Humanist Latin, and Humanist Latin might start with Petrarch in the 1300s, which is a Latin that represents a more scholarly tradition rather than the more practical language of medieval Latin, that sees itself as the heir of antiquity and distinct from the Middle Ages. And that's actually how
Hmm.
the Middle Ages are invented because you've got people who think that there's wonderful antiquity, there's us, and there is this middle period which is not as good as
Right.
us, and certainly not as good as antiquity.
And in fact, the Middle Ages exist because of people who were periodizing Latin.
Precisely.
Right?
So,
Yeah. This is
yes.
very important to remember.
Yes, yes, it happens. I mean, something like it happens in other cultures. There's a middle period in Chinese history, but that's a different period to the Middle Ages in
Yeah.
Europe.
Right. And that phenomenon does not exist in Greek, on the Greek side, because there's no Neo-Greek. Atticism revived like in the first century AD and is the norm after that. And I don't know that there's a period in which Greek writers self-consciously were trying to break from some, oh, for 1,000 years we've been doing it wrong and we need to do it right. And I just don't think that there is that kind of moment of self-conscious rupture.
But there might be a number of moments of, as in Latin, of a sort of renaissance or ever
Sure.
feeling the need to be more correct. But yeah, I think you're
Yeah, yeah,
sure.
yeah, yeah. I mean, they're always critiquing each other for Atticist failings. I mean, but that's just a feature of Atticism that you're always critiquing your peers for using some wrong word or yeah. Um,
One difference, of course, is that they are languages that would have been mutually comprehensible to a time traveler. I mean, they might have laughed, but they would have been able to
hmm,
understand themselves. And there are differences, but they're fundamentally the same grammar and syntax. For me, as a non-speaker of Greek, the experience of looking at modern Greek is very, very different from the experience of looking at Greek from antiquity
sure.
or the Middle Ages.
Oh, yes. Well, so the two languages have that feature in common after a certain point that their writers are speaking either one version of the language or a different language at home or in the street, and they're nevertheless writing this very conservative, in terms of grammar, and vocabulary language when they're writing, a history or a saint's life or an oration or something like that. Actually, this is an important point about these two languages. So, what are some of the main features, or factors rather, that make these languages in their written form so conservative, so stable over these very long periods of time? Is this something that we can explain somehow?
I think we can explain it. I mean, we can. The phenomenon, of course, is not just one that is applies to Latin and Greek. It applies to other languages as well. And the name for it is a Latin name. It's classical. It's a classical language. It's one which has got a series of models to which you return. It's a language that has been frozen in time. And the point at which Latin is frozen in time is roughly the end of the Roman Republic, the middle of the first century BC, and the very, very beginning of the empire. The two writers, though there are many others, above all associated, this is the greatest prose writer, which is Cicero, who is famous for defending the Republican system of government, but being killed a year after Julius Caesar was in 43 BC, and Virgil, the greatest poet, who starts writing a year after Cicero's death, and he ends up justifying the regime of the first emperor, Augustus. And these works are just, it cannot be emphasized how much they were instant classics because Virgil becomes the basis for grammatical education. So if you're a Roman schoolboy or schoolgirl, but perhaps more schoolboys, you learn to read, you learn your first letters, and then you go to the grammarian. And the first words are the first words that you do are the first words of the Aeneid, Arma virumque cano, arms the man I sing. And you go through developing your understanding of grammar on the basis of Virgil. And then maybe in your teens, you will go on to your rhetorical education, and Cicero is the basis, the inspiration for rhetorical education. And he's actually a topic for rhetorical debates. So you get to pretend to be a friend of Cicero's, advising him not to rile Mark Antony and to save his life. I mean, there are lots of other rhetorical topics, but Cicero is himself is among them. And so there's this amazing period, and this is also when other famous authors come from, like the historian Sallust, the lyric poet Horace, Julius Caesar. And of course, it's also the period at which the teaching of Latin is not just happening in Italy, but it's spreading across the elites of the provinces of the whole Western Mediterranean, the places where you have modern languages descended from Latin, like France and Spain and Portugal, also modern North Africa, modern Tunisia and Algeria, also parts of the Balkans. So people are learning Latin there and they are using the texts of this period and they continue to use the texts of this period and they use syntax based on the texts of these period and they used and the standardized word forms and spellings of that period, and that's the basis of teaching. Most of our standard the grammars that survive from antiquity are in fact from later antiquity, but they're teaching the language of texts written at that period of the late Republic and early Empire. I think that's not actually very dissimilar to Greek. But as we've already touched on, the spoken language is changing under them.
Yeah.
And these changes can't but help have some impact on the written language. And they're changing in public in how you pronounce the language. Though again, we have also in Greek, but there are bigger changes in Greek. In Latin,
Yeah.
it's really that the w sound becomes v, and the diphthong I becomes e, a monophthong. So Caesar would change to Caesar, and the letter C later on palatalizes before E and I, which is why in the Middle Ages, you'd say Cesar in French or Cesar in Italian, but it doesn't change very much. So you've got a situation where people learn to speak in two modes. You always have that situation in almost any set of circumstances. People will not speak like they write.
Right. In English, even.
In English, absolutely. My nephew's growing up in Switzerland. There are two forms of German there that
Yes.
are very different.
Also that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think it's fair to say that most of the Latin teaching that takes place today focuses on what you call the classical Latin. So in terms of the distribution of like, personnel and staff and textbooks and grammar books and so forth, it focuses on this period. Now, these texts are probably a minority in terms of bulk, right, of the surviving corpus or the existing corpus of Latin literature. Two questions here. First, how disproportionate is this? In other words, how small a portion of the corpus are the classical texts? And secondly, what other academic disciplines take on other periods of Latin literature?
The basic rule is with some little exceptions, the further you go on in time, the more Latin exists and the more Latin survives. In his book on Latin Story of a World Language, Jürgen Lehnhardt estimates, I can't remember what he estimates exactly, whether it's 0.1% of text that's in Latin or classical Latin text, or is it 0.01%, but it's not very much. So
Right.
to give you some figures, shall we say let's use the term ultra classical for Latin texts up to 100 or 200 AD, and there are about 6 million words up to that period surviving, which is not a lot. I mean, that's like
No,
that's
Gavin,
five Prousts.
yes,
Um,
my big history was 500,000.
yes, yes. Now, Latin is actually a more efficient language in terms of words than
Than my
mine.
history, yes.
Yeah. I mean, when I translate from Latin, I've worked out a portion of 7 Latin words to 12 English words.
Well,
That's
yes, they don't have 37 articles like we do in Greek.
they don't know. Still, and that includes things which we think of as absolutely massive, like the Pliny the Elder's Natural History in 37 books. We think of that as something huge. Cicero,
Mm.
massive author. And if you go to the fourth, fifth, and sixth centuries, in that period, you've got nearly 30 million words surviving, according to the Library of Latin Texts. That's probably a slight underestimate because people don't include every single text in this somewhat less classical period in the
Right.
tradition. You've got a very similar bulge in Greek in that period from
Can I interject
Because
some
of the
numbers?
jet fund. Yes, please do.
So just this morning, I went into the TLG and I did some rough calculations.
Uh-huh.
For the same period of classical, like down to 200, we
Mhm.
have about 30 million words in Greek.
Yes,
And after that, it gets bigger. There's the late antique bulge, which is even
yes,
bigger because we have like Galen and Chrysostom. I mean, that, yeah,
of course.
okay. And then there's a dip, and then it picks up again. So the interesting thing for me, and I got to thinking about this, that 6 million words of classical Latin preserved basically during the whole Western Middle Ages, and 30 million classical Greek preserved essentially in Constantinople. This is a huge disparity in how much of the ancient literature of each language is preserved, given how many people are involved in it or could potentially be involved in it. What I'm saying is, it just seemed to me, and this is just this morning, and my instincts could be completely off here, but that fewer people in Constantinople preserved way more literature than the whole of the Western Middle Ages did for 1,000 years.
No, it's true, but I think that I suspect it represents the fact that there was more there to preserve in the first place.
Right. Okay.
They'd been writing it for six
Right.
centuries or so longer, and it was written over a wide
Right.
geographical area. As soon as you get past the fourth century BC, it's written over an enormous geographical area.
Right.
So
So you're
so
saying they might have actually preserved it in proportion to how much had been produced originally. Like they might the disparity might reflect that in part.
I think we shouldn't necessarily think that Greek is better preserved. There's another interesting difference, which is that if a Latin text, if you're a Latin author, gets to the Carolingian era, to the ninth century, it will almost certainly survive. I mean,
Hmm.
over 99% survival. And I don't think that's the case in
No.
Byzantium because of
No, no,
both
no.
1204 and
No, 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 no. Yes. Yes, understood.
catastrophes.
Okay. Yeah, so tell us about some of the other academic fields. So the rest of Latin
Yeah,
has been
yeah.
carved up and allocated to whom?
So it's not, the question is it actually allocated to them? Are they really that interested or do they just use it? So first of all, in classics departments, we do teach and research things from other periods. My department, which is admittedly slightly unusual in this, has a medieval Latinist and an early modern Latinist. They do this more rarely. And if you look at the standard teaching texts or syllabi in classics, overwhelmingly from the earlier period, from that 0.1% or whatever it was. Other departments, naturally, lots of things belong in departments of religion or theology or divinity or whatever you call them. I said 6 million words of Latin from the early period. There are 5 million words of Augustine alone. Um,
Okay. Enough said.
uh, and obviously, I, like many other classicists, love teaching the confessions. But when it gets to his theological disputes with the Donatists, we're not so keen about studying these, although of course, there's lots of classicists doing good work on Augustine's sermons and letters and other works. But it's going to be more of interest to a religion department. But the problem is, it has a disadvantage, I think, in that it's not a scriptural language like Greek or Hebrew. That does
Right.
mean that what are the things that people are going to learn? Well, they will learn Latin, especially in countries like, say, Germany or Italy, with a tradition of that, but it's perhaps slightly disadvantaged. Another area that should have lots of Latin, but perhaps really doesn't, is philosophy. It's the language in which all sorts of works,
Mhm.
Augustine, Aquinas, down to Spinoza, are writing in. But again, it certainly doesn't have the glamour within philosophy faculties that Greek has. And then there's the general fact that actually philosophy departments often just want to do things in translation anyway. They don't care about. They can be quite monolingual. Apologies to any multilingual philosophers who are listening to this. And the other thing is that I suspect that they're not really as interested in the medieval and early modern philosophy are not major areas in most philosophy departments. So that's another sort of yes but no. Probably slightly better homes for them are medieval and modern languages, including English language. That's often where you can find medieval Latinists. Also, medieval and early modern history, because if you're going to be a Western medievalist or Western early modernist or an intellectual historian, you're going to need Latin. And the other thing that gets combined with this is paleography, reading of manuscripts. But there's a bit of a problem here because you're kind of a technical skill in those departments. You're not the central aim of study. And so there's a danger. One sees medieval Latin jobs advertised in history departments, and they don't include a research element because they're basically just there to teach.
Right.
I can name one more subject, which is not in every country, but in countries which have a Roman law tradition. It's a bit lawyers can cover large chunks of Latin. This is, I think, of Germany, Poland, Italy.
My father had to study that. He's a Greek lawyer. He doesn't know, he knows only Greek, but when he was in law school, they had to do Roman law.
Yes.
And he did have the corpus, but I think they use the Byzantine translations that have so many Latin words in them, sometimes transliterated, but sometimes written in Latin, that he knew the technical Latin vocabulary, but like he didn't know Latin for sure.
Yes, and of course they won't teach students Latin,
Yeah.
except for the sort of going on to research.
But he would often break out into these technical Latin legal terms. Where is that coming from? Anyway, yeah. And then there's also like Renaissance studies. And so far as that is a
Yes.
field, it exists in lots
Sure,
of different
sure. I was
places.
thinking of those in terms of the history and history
Yeah.
of languages, but you're yes,
Yeah.
yeah. Again, in Renaissance studies, it's something that people. There are many very fine Latinists who are working in these fields. It's a prerequisite. It's not perhaps the main thing that they were
Right.
doing. I suspect that one of the reasons that forbid doing a classics degree should be as preparation for becoming a specialist in the Western Renaissance. It's
Yeah. So, with all of this as background, why were you thinking about periodization as a problem in Latin literatures? What problems were you seeing that you decided to write a more systematic discussion of how and why we periodize Latin?
so this is something I've been thinking of since my doctoral first book project on Ammianus Marcellinus, which was published in 2008. Ammianus is a fourth century AD historian, and I'm currently back with Ammianus. I'm translating him and working on a new critical text. That book was a literary study, and to my mind, what he was doing as a literary artist was really very powerfully engaged with the Latin tradition. But I had this odd experience. I was working on a major author, and when I spoke to literary Latinists, they usually knew next to nothing about this major author because it's after 150 or thereabouts, and
Mm.
that's kind of alien territory. Roman historians that I talked to thought, he's a great writer and a fascinating source, and I could have conversations with them much more easily. And then there was the problem that when you did have Latinists who were working on him, they came up with this they'd sort of absorbed the history of Latin literature that they were taught, which led to them seeing the fourth century as an age of decline, of pagan writers like Ammianus being battered by Christians. And so if Ammianus alludes to earlier authors and plays with them, it's because he's shoring fragments against his ruin. He's collecting something from a fundamentally alien period. But it's just the Roman Empire. It's just the Latin-speaking Roman Empire. It's the same political and social unit as the authors of the first century AD. So that started me off. Then for a little over a decade, my colleague Aaron Piltari and I have been editing a Cambridge History of Later Latin Literature, which is due to be published at the end of this year in two volumes about 40 contributors. I'd actually been thinking about it for some years before we started. And what we did was largely in reaction to this ignorance of the literary Latinists of the Latin of the Roman world after a certain point. And so our coverage is from 100 AD to about 700 AD. So it's called later Latin literature, not because it's the later half of Latin literature, but it's the later part of Latin literature within the history of the Roman Empire. And then I got asked to write this piece in the Cambridge Critical Guide to Later Latin Literature by Roy Gibson and Chris Whitton. And I was very glad that they asked me, but they asked me because I think they knew that I would have something to say. And though they themselves are both specialists in what might traditionally be called classical Latin on the earlier period, but both of them recognize that the blinkered focus on the first quarter, or perhaps the first 20% of the history of Latin literature that goes on in classics departments is intellectually indefensible and, not really good for the health of Latin as a discipline. And they actually push for that rather eloquently in their introduction that Latinists have to get out more.
Yeah.
Uh, and they try to make all the chapters have coverage of that goes beyond that period, although it's not always easy. And they have separate chapters on Neo-Latin and medieval Latin. Originally, they didn't want to have a chapter on medieval Latin because they just thought all the chapters should encompass it. But it turns out that even those of us who think that this is important, medieval Latin is really important and should be more part of the subject, don't necessarily have the knowledge to write that. So I think those chapters are both absolutely splendid.
I've run into some similar problems. Let's set aside the fact that I'm a historian. I mean, I do work a lot on Greek texts. And insofar as I do so, I work on the later texts, the Greek equivalents of Ammianus, that kind of period. And nevertheless, I have always been in a classics department, right? First at Ohio State and now at University of Chicago. There are very few classics departments, at least in the Anglo sphere, that have, let's say, a Byzantinist. You could probably count them on the, fingers of both hands. In the US, probably one hand. I nevertheless believe that the break that classicists postulate, which on the Greek side falls somewhere in the early third century.
Yep.
So basically, when Philostratus puts down his pen, that is the end of classical literature. And after that, it's late antiquity. It's, whatever people who study it want to call it, but we're not going to go there. It's a bad neighborhood. It's very shady. And, you're going to run into some bishops or some holy men throwing torches or whatever, right? And so, authors like Procopius, who's like the equivalent, as it were, of Ammianus, is just immersed in classical forms of writing and in conversation, in like ongoing conversation with those traditions. It's not like he's reaching to some distant past that's out of reach in some way. No, no, no. These are very much alive traditions. And so, in my view, and I wrote this long article last year, but it's kind of in limbo still. I postulate that on the Greek side, roughly 100 to 650 is a kind of unit of literary time, the imperial Greek, that's very interconnected and that is in fact separated from what comes before by the complete indifference to like Hellenistic, especially prose. Interest in it just dies off because of revived Atticism. And afterwards, by the collapse of literary production in the seventh century, which is an actual thing, it's not a later selection kind of gap. Anyway, so I was thinking about that, but I get mixed reactions to that thesis. I think it applies perhaps more to Anglo-American views of classics, whereas in more German, Italian, French philological traditions, I actually found this like textbooks of Greek literature in those languages go down to the end of like late antiquity. And that it's the Anglo-American model that might be the more problematic one here. Anyway, that was some initial impressions, and I'm gonna have to go back and look at that some more.
I think you're entirely right about the difference. There are many more professors of medieval Latin and Neo-Latin in continental Europe than there are
Mm.
in the Anglophone world. The other thing which you put your finger on, which I didn't quite say, is that on the Latin side too, there's a fall off in production after the bulge of the fourth to the sixth
Mm.
centuries, and so that is part of the reason for periodizing there. But there's also, which I think is a distinction from your period, there's the phenomenon that Latin literature is associated with the institution of the Roman state and the things that go with that, the schools, the government jobs, and these things still have some reason to exist after the end of the Roman Empire, but it kind of fades away. You can measure Roman literature in the West should continue a little bit after the end of the Roman Empire. Roman identity continues at least for a while before it.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that there's a big similarity beginning of that period, first century, circa 100. You can certainly see a lot of authors who provide new models for late antique writers. You can see Quintilian organizing theory of education, and when people write um, practice speeches for school kids to imitate, they do so under the name of Quintilian for centuries after. You have not a particularly major figure, but Pliny the Younger, who is nonetheless the person who invents the panegyric of an emperor in Latin, and also it invents the personally curated, well, he doesn't invent it, but he has perhaps the most influential form of personally curated letter collection.
Mm.
Is a self-portrait. You have Martial, who is the epigram writer, the epigrammatist that all later writers of epigram want to imitate. You have Juvenal and Persius, the two most characteristic satirists. And even if there isn't satire as a genre in late antiquity, they're still trying to write like Juvenal and Persius and all sorts of other things which are not satire, which may be prose. So you've got a series of new models. So it's a nice place to start, but I wouldn't say that that's a slightly more arbitrary point and for us to start our
Right.
Cambridge history than perhaps your periodization.
I think there's room for discussion here, and I'm going to look for that volume when it comes out to see, where these two traditions might resonate. Um, we've already mentioned a couple of factors that, let's say, have persuaded our classicist colleagues to stay away from our dangerous neighborhoods. And you mentioned decline, and Christianity is another one. I'd like to discuss those a little bit more, but first I want to give the audience a sense of what your argument is trying to do in this piece, in the sense that you go through a number of reasons or factors that have been used to periodize Latin. And you just talk about them, like what are they based on, how valid are they, and so on. And so specifically, you discuss linguistics, which is the language itself, meter, prose rhythm, the political context in which the literature is written, religious change, and the history of the book. And we can't talk about all of those here, obviously. I do encourage the audience to look at your discussion. It's very, very lucid, and I think you bring the issues into, very clearly to light. I do want to talk about decline. What kind of decline are our colleagues afraid of? Is it like a general sense of decline, or is it some specifically literary kind of decline?
I think that they don't necessarily know, and I think that the literary decline and the historical decline have been mixed up together in people's minds. People will think of a linguistic falling off, a derivativeness, and of course, since people thought that Virgil and Cicero and Sallust and Horace, these authors of the end of the first century BC, were the ideal writers, and other writers were writing in a way that took them as the model. Well, obviously, they measure up later writers against them and say, well, quite a good writer, but derivative. And if people's language differs from theirs, they will be sniffy about
Mm,
that. So Ammianus, like many of his contemporaries, doesn't always bother to use the subjunctive in an indirect question. He uses the indicative. Now, this had actually is one of those things that had always happened in Latin right from the beginning, but in the classical period, it becomes seen as the correct thing to do to use the subjunctive. And I suspect that, and you can still see some cases in poetry where nobody could change it because it would ruin the meter of the classical period where you do have
yeah,
such things. So there's the construction. There's is it it seems it's built into this sort of classicizing system that things will not be either be derivative of as not or not as good. Okay, so that's one aspect. Then there is political decline, and obviously the Roman state in the say the let's say the end of the second century is more powerful than it is 2 centuries later. Objectively, a bit somewhat more powerful. And you have this model of Gibbon in the decline and fall, which, as he writes it, of course, is way more sophisticated than many of the parodies of
yes,
it.
agreed.
Yeah, decline isn't particularly helpful, doesn't particularly work for what he does because the fourth century Roman Empire was a very powerful state with almost exactly the same geographical coverage as the second century Roman Empire. But there is a case that people have sort of associated these changes, and Gibbon himself is constantly indulging in literary criticism. He says of Claudian, he soared above the heads of his feeble contemporaries and placed himself among the poets of imperial Rome. And a tendency to see literary decline coinciding with this political decline and finding evidence from the one in the other.
Yeah,
And obviously, then Christianity ties into this because the way that Christian literature involves using some sorts of Christian language, technical language. It's not that it's a different Christian Latin language, but there are elements of technical language which same thing happens in Greek. The language of the Gospels is not the sort of language you're taught to use at school. So the idea of decline has kind of been swallowed. It's been subsumed without too much conscious thought. I think if you asked people to think about literary decline and whether they believe in it, most of them probably say no, that doesn't make much sense. But one of the things about periodizations is that it's not just a conscious set of decisions that we make. It's a bunch of convenient, no doubt, subconscious ways of thinking
yeah.
about.
I always wondered about decline because I can easily see an argument that decline makes a period interesting. Like, let's grant decline. Let
Yes,
Just for the sake of argument, right? That should make the period and the literature it produces more interesting, not less. These are people coping with more interesting circumstances.
yes.
Yeah.
I mean, to give you one example, I talked about the fourth century empire as a very powerful institution, but the Western Empire has gone tits up by 430. And
Yeah.
when Augustine dies, the Vandals who had crossed into Gaul and Spain have crossed into Africa and are besieging his town in North Africa. And that is the most productive and one of the most brilliant periods of Roman literature, precisely that period of
Hmm.
line. It's where you get a whole load of new models that are going to be famous for centuries. And the church fathers like Augustine and Jerome and Ambrose, poets like Claudian and Prudentius, my historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who isn't very influential, but who is brilliant. Exactly. You can have great literature in times of decline.
Now, about Christianity.
Yeah.
So let me try to make a kind of steel man argument for where our colleagues might be coming from. And let's just set aside the fact that many of them are allergic to it.
Yes.
Like they want to be classicists specifically to live in an intellectual world, right? A culture that doesn't have Christianity in it, much less, popes and crusaders. Okay, let's set that aside. That's a real thing, but whatever. So you could make the argument that when literature is produced in a Christian context, in order to properly read and appreciate and study that literature, you do need to understand Christian, the sources of Christian belief and doctrine and literature. So you need to have studied the Bible and the theologians, right, and the church councils, and like to whatever degree these things are shaping the literary environment, which is in itself another area of expertise. Like this isn't like it does require a considerable investment of time and training. And so classicists will happily say, well, no, we'll leave that to people who study that culture.
I think that what you describe is absolutely right. It's a long established divergence. In my university, the Latin professor used to be called the Professor of Humanity, and the Latin department, Department of Humanity. And this is the opposite of divinity.
Hmm.
Uh, so the idea of a division in these Western European societies where the churches are more dominant than they are now, people wanted to establish a boundary of convenience. Whether our colleagues should be like this is an interesting question because you might make the same arguments about studying literature from pre-Christian times that there are all sorts of technical details about politics and about pagan, in inverted commas, religions that will be relevant to understanding it. Of course, this is an area of study, but I certainly don't think that all our colleagues get into that particular
Mm,
area and use it
exactly.
as a
Yeah, yeah.
so I think that this, yes, we can understand not perhaps engaging with tracts on theology, but there's plenty of literature that is not theological tracts and that does not require that level of engagement. So we have to accept that not everybody's going to do everything, but it would be a really very good thing if it could be understood by classicists that maybe for their second big project they might dip out of their familiar
Yes.
period and go to periods where there are many texts that have not been edited, that have not been translated, that have not been read. It's an interesting test of a scholar whether you find that an exciting challenge or a reason not to do something because you haven't got the normal crutches to keep you going.
And this is where I think that articles such as yours will play an important role because they have to convince the field that this is legitimate work. Because it's fine for an individual scholar to do it, but if the system will punish them by saying, well, this isn't work that counts for the thing that we hired you for because of the standards of the field, so you're helping to change those standards. So I agree. So some of the points that you made there are precisely why, like, I'm not sold on the Steelman version of the Christian argument because, first of all, there are plenty of texts written in this period that are not immersed, like Ammianus and I think Procopius.
Yes.
You can do a lot of work on them without being an expert in theology or papacy or whatever. But at the same time, I'm not sure that we should necessarily concede even the church fathers to scholars who read them exclusively from a Christian, either confessional or identity approach, because a lot of what they're doing is often not that, or they're repurposing more classical templates for Christian purposes. And we don't see that if we're not actually engaging with both sides. So, yeah, there are very, very few authors I would just put completely right in the camp of like, yes, this is Christian literature.
Yes, I think absolutely true. So one of the reasons, of course, that more survives from this period is that there are things that are, that are perhaps not even literature,
Yeah.
accounts of church councils or
Yes.
whatever. But even those church accounts of church councils have interestingly rhetorically constructed letters by thoroughly interesting people,
Yes.
and they have records of the spoken language as taken down by shorthand writers, which should be of interest, even if it's formal spoken language. Lots of things to do there. Yes, I mean writers like Jerome is a fantastic classical writer.
Yeah.
I mean he has the disadvantage of being odious, but he is an absolutely glorious polemicist and author of fiction in the case of his Three Saints' Lives. All sorts of things that you could get out of Jerome. An absolutely vast corpus of letters, which are beautiful illustration of attempts to create authority and social climbing and
All right.
wonderful resource. There are so many brilliant documents. And yes, part of it comes down to what you think the subject should be. Should it be pressing a new theory on a text that's had 10 books in the last 10 years, or saying, oh, well, there hasn't been a commentary on this particular play of Euripides for nearly 20 years, so it's
Yeah.
time for another one. Or might it actually be about that it's worth trying to find out things that are new rather than just to finesse and compete in other areas? And sometimes people should write books on the classics, but many people might find it easier to be original and to make discoveries if they ventured slightly further afield. And from the point of view of the discipline, I do think that if classics departments could engage more with their colleagues in Western European history and in later literatures, they might be seen as more relevant and useful to the university as a whole.
Yes. All right. On that note, I will close by quoting an emperor. This from the 15th century. This is Ioannis VIII Patlioloros John VIII at the Council of Ferrara, Florence. We have some transcripts of the acts because you mentioned the church councils and how some of them might actually be classicizing in some ways. And in the council, so he's in Italy, and he says at some point, well, we have a poet in my part of the world called Homer. And he says, and I quote, it is time to break for lunch. So, Gavin, thank you so much. This was a wonderful piece to read, and I hope it will help spur me to produce my own version of the Greek equivalent. And thank you also for coming on to the podcast. It was fun to speak with you,
Very good to catch up, Anthony, and
and I'll see you in a month at the thing.
look forward to seeing you in a month in Chicago.
Take care.
Okay, you too.